Tonight on Nation to Nation, First Nations education has been in the news all week. Funding for language and culture will more than triple in British Columbia.
We can't be complete without our identity, our language, our culture, our history, our knowledge of the land that raises us.
It's big news for one Indigenous school in BC. The principal there says the new funding will go a long way.
We recently received $130,000, so that works out to just about $2,000 per student at my school, which we're really excited about.
There's also a new funding formula for the rest of the country, but it's not without its issues.
The way the department has proceeded is not very equitable. We had to meet no less than 3 times with Minister Philpott to address issues in terms of the way the interim funding formula was being negotiated.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran, and welcome to Nation to Nation. There's been a flurry of announcements this week related to on-reserve education. Most significantly, Indigenous Services and the AFN jointly announced earlier this week a new funding approach for K-12 education. The goal is to ensure funding is comparable to provincial systems and strengthen First Nations control over education. To explain it all, I'm joined by John Martin. He holds the education portfolio for the Assembly of First Nations in the Quebec-Labrador region. Mr. Martin, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you.
Now, how is this funding approach all that different from the old one? Like, how has it improved?
Well, for one thing, First Nations across this country have been asking for decades for a new way of funding education services, something that resembles more the funding of education for the general public. And there's been different attempts at this. I believe the previous attempt was under the previous government, the Conservative government, Bill C-33, which sought to impose school board type of funding. Not something that went over so well. Right now we're looking at formula-generated funding rather than going with proposals. The communities were burdened with reports and proposals and proposals. It was almost like your school was a project or something like that, where you had to continuously submit proposals to get funding for education services. Although there was some core funding, but a large part of, I would say more than half of it was proposal-based.
You mentioned Bill C-33, the First Nations Education Act that the previous Premier Stephen Harper tried to impose. So I suppose, how is this fundamentally different than what is going on now?
Well, that's one of the things is that First Nations have always maintained we've never ceded jurisdiction over First Nations education. And going towards provincial school boards is something that I think would have affected that jurisdiction to some extent, which a lot of First Nations did not buy into. This interim funding formula, and I say interim, I guess it's because it's temporary. What we're looking to is to have regional funding agreements. At least that's the approach of the government at this time. Regional funding agreements, which would be formula-based, but based on what First Nations in the region want to have in their formula, to define the formula. What I've seen a lot of is in the statements that have come out, one by the AFN, one by ISC, very little control of strengthening jurisdiction and jurisdiction at all. It's about Indian control, and for sure Indian control is good, but I think we need to not lose sight of the fact that it is our jurisdiction in education that we seek to strengthen and to implement in our communities.
You talked about how this core funding may work, but specifically, are we talking there'll be 5-year or 10-year arrangements now? Do we know that?
Yes, well, I guess the idea behind it is to have predictable, secure funding. The other issue is equity in terms of funding. One of the things that we've encountered in the interim funding formula in our region is that the way the department has proceeded is not very equitable. We had to meet no less than 3 times with Minister Philpott to address issues in terms of the way the interim funding formula was being negotiated with our region. It has a lot of inequities. I mean, when we talk about inequities, we can talk about communities in our region that may get a tuition rate of approximately $15,000 in one community, and in another community approaches the $50,000 mark. You know, I understand there's remoteness factors and so forth, but you know, that kind of demonstrates the issues that we have with the formula. ISC in our regions decided to break off negotiations the end of October, I believe it was, but we continue to find errors and mistakes. You know, and that's been the issue all along. We've had to analyze this formula, look at it, and time again we've brought it back with mistakes to be fixed, and the last one was a $9 million mistake in the Quebec region, you know, that affected our schools. So there's a lot of difficulties, I think, in you know, in this interim funding formula. We're hoping that the next phase will be certainly different from what it is, and not a unilateral imposition on how things work.
So it sounds like you're still not quite happy with what the Indigenous Services is presenting so far.
I think the approach is the big issue. We're happy at the fact that this is no longer going to be project-based funding for First Nation schools. I think that is a step up. But I think the business of education, the expertise is in the communities. And it really came out that the expertise is not with the Department of Indian Affairs. You know, in presenting this formula, we've had to do a tremendous amount of work on addressing a whole array of issues in it. But it is a movement. It is a movement in the right direction. That is for sure.
There are a few dollar figures given in this particular announcement, except that the Indigenous Services and the AFN said there'll be $1,500 per student per year to support culture and language. How significant is that?
Well, if you compare $1,500 per student to address issues of First Nations language and the loss of First Nations language in our community, compare that to the $64 million that was given to the BC region for the French language. It costs a lot more than $1,500 per student to be able to address the issues and turn the situation around with regards to language in our communities and in our schools. The other thing that they don't mention is that we have First Nations students that live in our communities, go to school off reserve, and there's absolutely nothing for them. You know, and I believe that's not right. Our students should have, you know, some support to be able to pursue these cultural activities and language initiatives in the provincial school system, you know, when we have the numbers that justify it.
Now, of course, no new funding was announced. This is just money that was already set out in the 2016 budget. So what kind of an impact do you expect to see from this a big announcement from Monday?
Well, for sure, the impact is that there's an increase of funding levels in the community. The unfortunate thing that it's not equitable. And, you know, you have something called protected funding, which means if you're under funding protection for certain amounts of money, it simply means that the formula was inequitable. The formula did not generate enough funding for your community. Okay, that's something important to understand. It also has a significant impact on communities that are block funded versus those communities that are not. Communities who are block funded, yes, may retain certain dollars, but then after a year or 2 years, they lose their money. You know, in the Quebec region, we have the unique situation where the province of Quebec has decided that they will no longer charge tuition fees to First Nations people. So this complicates the matter because First Nations have been providing services and support services to their students, you know, that go to school off reserve. And the department's approach on it is simply to cut funding, and that's it. So what happens to all the support services that we have been providing to, you know, to our students that go to school off reserve? So there's a lot of things that, you know, that are happening and not well thought out. The lack of consultation with our people obviously is a very big one, you know, or the refusal to simply listen to the expertise that's there.
Well, we'll certainly be talking about this a lot more as we go on the months coming up as we get closer to the federal election. Mr. Martin, I want to thank you for talking to me.
We will, and we'll be, just for last point, we will be bringing together communities next week that are negatively impacted by this, and we will be coming out with some statements regarding that situation.
We'll look forward to hearing from that. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you.
After the break, we talked to a BC First Nation principal about the need for improved education funding. Welcome back. Indigenous Services' allocations for on-reserve schools has increased by 30% since 2016. That's when the feds announced $2.6 billion in new funding. As we heard before the break, it's now going to be easier to get. One school on British Columbia's Central Coast just recently got a boost in spending. Principal Justin Magnuson of the Kitasoo Community School says it's going to help with their language and culture programs. Joining us now is Principal Magnuson. Principal Magnuson, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, you've been an educator for quite a long time, not just out there in BC, but in Saskatchewan. What has, in your opinion, been the biggest challenge in getting First Nations kids to graduate?
I think, the two contexts where I've worked are quite different. I worked urban in a big public school division prior to this, and now I work in a small school in the First Nations context. So I think the challenges are quite different.
Can you name, I guess, the biggest challenge, the biggest difference that you've seen?
Well, I think within the inner city context, poverty plays a huge bearing on families and high school students on being successful and graduating within, the chronological years that the public division wants to see. However, they do show great success in graduating students over a longer period. So I guess it really determines what we define as success in the urban context. In the rural context, the schools are continually underfunded. Like my school, for example, needs significant maintenance on the building. And the problem with that is we don't have adequate funding yearly to hire the maintenance staff necessary to keep the building in proper order. So I would say the funding around maintenance and infrastructure is a huge opportunity for a government to implement, as well as to fund language, culture, and those land-based practices that are important to Indigenous students here in the First Nations context.
Now, your school recently received some funding from the federal government. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so in BC, we're lucky. We have a tripartite agreement between BC, the federal government, and Indigenous schools. And through that tripartite agreement, we recently received $130,000. So that works out to just about $2,000 per student at my school, which we're really excited about. Our school has had a real strong language and culture program for the past 5 years, and now we're able to extend that. We're working with local community to develop a land-based curriculum. We're embedding language and culture, and everything we do as a school is our top priority. This model is not necessarily an immersion model, but the students will have contact with language and culture in every subject area every day. It should be almost minute to minute where they're interacting with their content, right? Their traditional language, their traditional culture, their traditional spirituality, and their traditional knowledges that really should be able to guide their learning and still, meet those curricular competencies that the BC Ministry of Education sets forward for students to achieve in order to graduate. So we think that, implementing this plan will not only make our students stronger, but result in better outcomes for them after high school. So whether that's in the workforce here or post-secondary outside of our community, we think if we can build a confident, strong cultural identity with our students, that will result in much more success, both in the workforce and at the post-secondary level.
Now, of course, earlier this week, there was a big announcement by Indigenous Services to dedicate $1,500 per student per year towards programs for culture and language. Do you think that on top of it what kind of a boost would that be to your programs there?
That's just the thing, right? We need core funding explicitly for Indigenous language, culture, and land-based learning. I think this current Liberal government has loved to use the word reconciliation, but I think the first step for a government to truly implement reconciliation, which is not a word I generally use or like to use, but I think how they can do that is to recognize that the marginalization of Indigenous culture and language is one of the root causes for the Indigenous socioeconomic disparity that we're experiencing in Canada today. And I think the only way for the Liberal government to achieve this is to recognize that our knowledge keepers and those people that hold this great Indigenous knowledge and culture and languages and practices have to be held in the same prestige as university-trained educators. And I think the only way the government has the power to do this is by increasing budgets so that we can adequately pay these knowledge keepers at the same level we're paying our teachers, because we have to value that knowledge in the same, with the same, value that we do our university educators. So I really hope that this funding continues and that it becomes part of our core funding, so we can, honor the people here from the First Nations who hold this knowledge and it's been passed down to them from their elders and from their families, and that we can have a part at the school to implement that for our students.
Now, of course, another part of that announcement on Monday was, when we're talking about dedicated core funding, was to get that, not that it's a year by year, but spread over several years. I guess, again, you would see that as something that would no doubt help the community you're teaching in.
Yeah, I mean, in the past, and I have to say, I'm a relatively new principal. I've only been at it for 4 months. But in the past, we bring in local people with non-core funding to share their knowledge, to share their family stories, to share their connection to the land. And we can only bring them in on it for a year, and then the grant doesn't exist the next year, or the funding's discontinued, and so it continues to marginalize our people who hold that knowledge. Right, but the knowledge or the monies for the people who went to university and got their bachelor's of education or got their degree, that funding's always in place. So we're sending a signal to our youth that one knowledge system is more important than another knowledge system. And none of these knowledge keepers have come to me ever and asked and said, I need to be paid the same as a university educated teacher. But I think it sends a message. Right? It sends a message that we value one knowledge system more than another, and we're going to pay a lot more for one of the systems and not the same for the other.
Principal Magnuson, of course, it's an election year coming up. What do you hope to see from the other parties when it comes to talking about Indigenous education?
The Conservative government obviously has a long track record of not doing best by Indigenous peoples. So I would love to see that when, Andrew Scheer finally tells us what he's going to do, as opposed to what he's not going to do, that he includes First Nations in that message. That would be a step in a huge direction for the Conservative Party, and I highly doubt that. And I think we as Indigenous people have to think, yes, the Liberals haven't followed through on everything we want them to, and they've fumbled a few of the files, but they're the first government since I've been around. I'm only 34, so I don't have a huge experience with federal governments, but they're the only government, in my opinion, that's made First Nations people a priority. Everybody else was every other government that I've seen, especially Stephen Harper's Conservatives, would never talk about Indigenous people unless they were confronted with issues. So I hope that we as First Nations people can recognize the good things that Liberals are doing, and hopefully in our minds they outweigh the negatives. And I just wonder, if not the Liberals, then who?
Well, I guess we'll have to see after the federal election next October. Principal Magnuson, I want to thank you for talking to me.
Yeah, no, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
After the break, an announcement in British Columbia has First Nations saying they're now in control of education. Welcome back. British Columbia First Nations have been moving toward control of their education since 1992. And since 2012, have been in a three-way deal between them, the province, and Ottawa. Yesterday, there was celebration over an even newer agreement signed on Squamish territory, with BC's Minister of Education, Indigenous Services, and the First Nations Education Steering Committee present. The newer deal promises more sustained funding. The Steering Committee's president, Tyrone McNeil, says that will let First Nations make decisions on how to educate their own children.
This is a BC-specific framework. It doesn't apply anywhere else in the country. Other regions could look and learn from us. They're certainly welcome to that, but it's not forced on them in any way. So we've had experience on these kind of agreements since 2012. So we're moving the playing field in such a way that we do have more control, not on paper, in actuality. We're the decision makers, with support of the federal government out of headquarters, out of the regional office, with support of the Ministry of Education and their team as well. So it's a comprehensive agreement. It's about us recognizing that nobody is better purposed to be decision makers in education than us ourselves. If we grow that to other communities, in my view, that makes everybody's job easier. But ultimately, it's about moving away from the Indian Act. We try not to operate as Indian Act bands. We're nations, we're regions of nations, focused on advancing not only the rights, but the successful indicators of our kids from kindergarten to grade 12, everybody working in unison.
The announcement of sustained funding will also allow for immediate improvements, and it also more than triples the funding for language and culture.
We recognize here in 2018, 2019, technology is playing a bigger and bigger role in education. So this agreement allowed us to put high-speed internet into every one of our schools throughout the province. We recognize that transportation is quite often an issue, so the agreement brings in special funding just for the purchase of school buses. It brings in funding dedicated to languages. It brings in funding that is dedicated in key areas that we determined are our priorities. So to take languages, for example, within our current funding system, there's about $5.5 million built into the funding, but this agreement brought in another $14 million new dollars dedicated to languages. And when I say languages, it's culture, it's cultural field trips, it's immersion, it's language as a subject, it's bringing elders in. It's that broad language culture piece. But we know you can't say education without including our language and culture, and vice versa. So it's dedicated in those fashions, recognizing our priorities and our needs. The need and want for us to instill and reinstill our identity in our kids from kindergarten to grade 12. Because we know we can't be whole, we can't be complete without our identity, our language, our culture, our history, our knowledge of the land that raises us. So it's not so much a priority on language and culture, it's language and culture is education to us. I would say period, but it's not quite full stop, but it's such a significant piece of it. The ideal education scenario for First Nations in BC is in our languages, through our languages.
That's our show for this week. Next week, Parliament is back in session in their new temporary home. A new Indigenous Languages Act and child welfare reform have been promised before the end of the month. We'll see if that does indeed happen. And if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.